Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us for our Monday strategic discussion and overview. I'll be joined by Michael Steger. Today is August 18th, and it has been an extraordinary week, day, as tonight's discussion is going to be on what President Trump is doing to provide leadership unlike we've never been seen before in a very long time in our country that's committed to true peace. As people know, last week President Trump met with a very important meeting with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, in Alaska, a very historic meeting, as they met in Anchorage, Alaska, and laid out plans, first steps toward achieving a lasting peace between Russia, Ukraine, and ending the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And as President Trump said, this is what he's committed to, stopping the wars. And this is not the first war and conflict that he's been in the center of putting an end to. And I can say, you look at what's happened from Pakistan, India, Middle East, all types of conflicts that have been ongoing. And President Trump has stepped in, defying the efforts of the imperialist British Empire, war mongers, and people who want nothing more than to see continued war. He is showing that not even a Nobel Peace Prize is going to be warranted enough for what this president is accomplishing. And so today, as a continuation of those efforts for bringing about peace between Ukraine and Russia, President Trump met with Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And then following that, he met with the many leading heads of state, European leaders at the White House in Washington, D.C. And so we're going to be talking tonight is what is the significance of this long term? What is being accomplished? As President Trump said, this is the first step. Now he's just put out a message on Truth Social just a few moments ago, thanking the leaders, including Zelensky and European leaders who met with him in the White House. And next, there's going to be a meeting set up between the Russian president and Ukrainian president on discussing the action plans for bringing about the peace, and followed by a trilateral meeting, which would include President Trump. So what does this all lead to? It's not just a matter of, and this is what we're going to discuss further, putting an end to war and having a lasting peace. But what does this bring about in terms of bringing about a recovery plan for that peace, for economic development? So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Michael for his opening comments. Before I do, I just want to share with people quickly here. If you haven't watched Barbara Boyd's update from earlier today, her strategic overview that she gave, you can find it on PrometheanAction.com. She made she highlighted the fact that in the middle of this drive for peace, you still have in Congress the war mongers, people like Lindsey Graham, pushing for more war and to stop the efforts of President Trump, especially by going with further sanctions on Russia. And I just want to show you where you can find this, and I can post it in the chat as well quickly here. So this is the Senate bill sponsored by Senator Lindsey Graham there, who's been against President Trump pushing more funding to Ukraine, more of this war going on for a very long time. Senate Bill 1241, and 84 senators have signed on to this. You can, if you go to this page here, you can type in your state and find your senators, and it will give you a list of all of the co-sponsors.
Keisha, you're muted.
For the 20, pardon me?
You were muted, but you're okay now.
Okay, for the 2026 election. And we'll come back to that a little bit more, but I just wanted to put that up as a campaign initiative that we're going to be strongly focusing on. So with that, let me stop my share and go ahead and bring in Michael.
Okay, good evening. So I think everyone was pretty engaged last week. We saw the build up towards this summit on Friday, and the media has gone, there's just been a level of chaos and confusion over what the summit represents, because to a large extent, people don't understand what we covered to a large degree last week, that the current global system is broken down and collapsed. You could say it's really essentially been dead since 2008. When you had the global financial crisis, remember, it was global. It was a complete crisis within the entire global central banking system. The central banks are the key controlling points of the international financial system. They went on a heyday of money printing. They've been on a heyday of money printing since 2008. And so the powers that be have been an increasing crisis because their reorganizing of the world, the elimination of nation states, the weakening of Russia, the kind of total control of China as a cheap labor camp, these kinds of developments that were part of this globalist worldview have not transpired the way they thought they would. And it's not as if, many people presume the globalists have this kind of infinite power. And what you see really is that they have very, very limited finite power. Much of what they have is akin to the Wizard of Oz. A lot of bluff and bluster and a little old man behind a curtain kind of impotently afraid that the masses are going to find out what's really going on. And that's kind of what happened. That's what happened in 2016. The masses kind of caught on and voted for Trump, and then they didn't quite get what was at stake, but certainly, as we've said many times, by 2020, they did get a sense of what was happening with the election steal, the lockdowns, and all the rest. And so then you've got a real awakening with this new Trump administration. And Trump is, in essence, talking to Putin to say, we've got to reorganize the world system. All of Trump's economic team have been looking at, as Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, often says, what Wall Street has had its day. It's time for Main Street to now have its turn. And that's very kind of quaint language to describe what? Well, we have completely bailed out Wall Street for now 17 years. The life of a child to adulthood has occurred since we've bailed out Wall Street to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars and sunk the United States into what was an additional something like $7 trillion of additional currency, something equivalent in terms of national debt, compounded by the Iraq War, and then compounded again with massive bailouts and money printing during COVID. So people wonder, well, why did we go to war with Ukraine? Why did Obama launch a coup d'etat that Joe Biden was then the viceroy for? Joe Biden basically took over Ukraine along with Hunter and some of Hunter's colleagues to basically run the economic kind of looting operation of Ukraine after the coup. People like John McCain, Lindsey Graham, but you also had Victoria Nuland, you had the Christopher Steele. Barbara Boyd covers a lot of this in her video from today. But many people are kind of saying, well, I think to a large extent, what the media completely just ignores over and over and over again is, how did we get to this point? Well, we got to this point, as many of you know, by the coup in 2014. That's what brought to bear the civil war in Ukraine. And for years, even though there were Russian mercenaries and others working in Ukraine, it was a civil war. Not referencing Crimea, that was something that Russia kind of took over very quickly, officially, because of the large naval base. But the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, where the major contentions remain, in Donetsk, in Luhansk, these are the provinces in the southeast of Ukraine, where it basically launched a civil war to basically overthrow or to reject Kiev regime authority in their provinces. Predominantly, they were Russian speakers. The Ukrainian Kiev government under Poroshenko and others had banned the Russian language. They had targeted in schools. There was a kind of a sense of an anti-Russian sentiment within the new Kiev regime that Biden and Obama, McCain and Lindsey Graham and Victoria Nuland and the whole kind of transatlantic coterie brought into power with the coup in 2014. And it was a coup. Yushchenko, the president, was willing to call for early elections, not within their constitution, but he was willing to call for early elections. As soon as he announced he was going to call for early elections, the right-wing, heavily armed mobs stormed the presidential palace. He fled, and the coup was completed. But there were even major concessions to keep Ukraine as a constitutionally consistent government, and that was rejected by these backers. So when you look at that dynamic, what you see is an intent to go to expanded war with Russia. That's what the intent was, knowing that Russia, and this is nothing new, Russia has had close ties and gotten engaged in wars because of threats to the Eastern Orthodox community in Serbia and in the Balkans. So it's not as if this profile you would consider pretty straightforward. If we target the Russian language, we target Russian speakers in this part of Eastern Ukraine, then Russia will be forced to act. And even to that extent, as this thing escalated into 2015, it still took 7 more years before Russians actually invaded. There were 7 years of 2 different treaties in the Minsk agreement between France and Germany with Russia. So there were all kinds of attempts to try to avoid this from going into a war or a full-fledged kind of Russia versus NATO conflict. But the question then you have to take one step back from, that's how we ended up deeply mired in this conflict that is now something Trump is trying to remove us from. And I'll get to that in just a second, just my thoughts on that. I'm sure many of you have thoughts on this. What I want to do tonight, as you can tell, is give some background. What are we actually looking at? What are the causes? Because if you don't know the causes, Putin says this, the Russians say this all the time, we want to address the underlying causes of the war. Well, and his underlying causes are still very localistic. They are not the broader strategic causes. I think Putin and the Russians are aware to some degree, to what degree I can't say, to some degree of the higher strategic causes. But we as Americans certainly should be, because we are the leading acting force under President Trump's administration for reorganizing the global system and addressing these deep and kind of long-lasting strategic issues, the kind of problem of the globalists. So the question is, why were the globalists intending to plunge us into war with Russia with the coup in Ukraine in 2014? Well, not unlike Obama's desperate effort to unleash race riots, whether it was in Missouri or New York or other locations, but to unleash race riots at the end of his administration for pure political control of the population, to kind of exacerbate. I mean, it was the beginning of the DEI age. Really began. I mean, it certainly began with Obama's presidency, but there was a certain kind of muted element to it until the last couple of years, where then the racial question was the predominant priority of racial tension of the Obama administration domestically. But the same kind of desperation was in the Ukraine situation and the war with Russia. And the question is, well, why? What's the underlying factor? The underlying factor is that this is not about a risk game that the globalists enjoy controlling territory. It is a question of controlling economic wealth and economic power. And the problem they have with this is that their system is beginning to erode and crumble. It's like one giant, the globalist economic program is one giant pyramid scheme. It's one giant increase. How long can we create demand for what we're selling? And at some point, when there's no longer an ability to increase that demand sufficiently, like a housing bubble, at some point you've exhausted the rate by which your demand can grow. You might be able to grow it a little bit more and a little bit more, but it becomes kind of Zeno's paradox, a little bit less each time, each new round of encouragement to get into the housing market, get into the housing market. You could say something similar to Bitcoin, but that's probably a whole other ball of wax with many people. But the question is, how do you create, regardless of what product it is, what bubble it is, the question is, how do you keep growing more and more demand for their system? At some point, that begins to run out. It ran out with the housing bubble in 2008-9. And they printed wads and wads of money. So much money, we literally have $10 trillion of pure, nearly pure cash just sitting in the US financial system. It's doing nothing but collecting interest rates from the Federal Reserve's higher rates now. $10 trillion just literally sitting. There's just so much money. That money isn't going into the stock market because the stock market's already maxed out and they kind of know it. Unless they can create some kind of new phenomena. The private equity guys right now are trying to get their hands on 401ks. They've been banned from dealing with 401ks. They've got to consistently try to get more money into the system to prop up the products they've been selling, even if because intrinsically they're way overvalued, they're way overpriced. They've been running a financial scheme. That's the entire, to some extent, global financial system at a certain level. Of course, there's a lot of healthy trade and productive activity, but as we know, too much or too little has gone into trade and productive activity, and tons have gone into where can you get 15, 20, 25, 30, 40% returns annually. Those numbers are unsustainable returns, but yet they've been driven by that kind of frenzy for like nearly 17, 20 years since the bailout regime kind of expanded into an unlimited bailout. We saw the unlimited bailout with Silicon Valley Bank, where they said, okay, there's no limit to now what the FDIC guarantees for insurance. No, what do you mean no limit? I mean, basically admitting this whole thing is just way too, there are so many contradictions built into our financial system that we're just going to kind of, we're not really accountable to anything. We can just say there's no limit to the FDIC insurance just to give people some kind of calm of mind for the moment. So part of this is driving this panic and frenzy is an increasing level of conflict and an increasing level of diminishing any nation that might threaten this orientation of looting, this orientation of control, and that certainly to some extent has been Russia. There, of course, is Russia's land area. I mean, even Trump sees it. Everyone sees the same thing. Russia's got 11 time zones. They've got tons of raw materials. Trump pointed it out last week, or I think right before his interview on the plane with Brett Baer. China has tons of people in very little land area. Russia has all the land area. Every nation, everybody sees this massive nation of Russia. And that's partly the problem, is that if you're no longer able to control the seas the way the British Empire once did, and the United States is not interested in really running a colonial imperial system, if it's moving back towards an industrial process of development of its own country, then the threat to Europe and the threat to this globalist control center of Europe is going to be increasingly dominated by this huge land power of Russia. And so we start to see the kind of game unfold of a growing financial crisis, the growing threat of a nation-state orientation of development, and the increasing desire then to plunge Europe into another war with Russia. One, it keeps Europe under control. And secondly, it continues to undermine or weaken or prevent Russia from becoming a major global power that would easily dominate or determine much of European economic orientations, contrary to British control, which is largely what controls Europe today. So this has kind of been building. And the economic threat of the global financial crash really accelerated this geopolitical outlook. And they've been trying to paper over it. But as we can see, they're not the smartest bulbs in the room. I mean, Powell is running a loss at the Federal Reserve currently. He spent $2.5 billion to build a basement in the Federal Reserve. Why do they need a basement? The level of kind of ignorance towards what's happening by a lot of these lackeys expresses a kind of a sense of, we don't really know how to solve the problem. All we can do is try to keep it going for our friends and hope that somehow it works, that we can somehow keep this going. There's no real sense of going back to productive industry, to re-establishing a strong dollar or a strong international financial system. It's a question of how do we keep the current system going, because so many of our friends have trillions and billions of dollars invested into this current scheme. We've got to keep that scheme going as long as possible. So I say all of this not because I think many of you probably know it, especially the financial system elements of this, and probably a lot of the geopolitics. But when you look at the media responses to this dynamic and what kind of is captured, even from people who are somewhat knowledgeable, I don't just mean mainstream media, what you see is a kind of a lack of regard for what are we actually attempting to accomplish here. These are the deeper underlying strategic factors: the collapse of the global financial system and its basic irreparability. You cannot repair the current financial system. You're going to have to essentially establish a new one. That doesn't mean you can kill the old one. It's kind of like changing the engines in a plane while you're still flying. So you've got only so much time while you can glide before the new one has to be fully operational. And so it's a process of kind of developing that dynamic. That's how I see what Trump's administration is largely trying to do. But there is a collapse of an irreparable financial system, kind of an archaic 19th century geopolitical view over the control of Europe, largely as the control over much of Eurasia and the world, and the total rejection of the question of a post-World War II nation-state system, which is what we covered extensively last week. The emergence of most nation-states didn't occur until even just after World War II. We talk of 190-some nations. Before World War II, there maybe were 4 dozen. There's 150 more new nations approximately. So Trump is well aware of this, and Putin is to some degree, and I can't say to what, aware of this. And we know that the two things they share in is that, and Trump said this at their brief press conference in Anchorage, that there is there was damage inflicted on the U.S.-Russian relationship by Russiagate. And Russiagate is what? It's the same people who ran the Ukraine coup. It is Obama and Biden and Brennan and Clapper, to some degree Comey and Steele and John McCain. John McCain was actually one of the early sources for the Steele dossier. So so they share in a sense of an immediate attack on the relationships of U.S. and Russia, and clearly trying to whip up antagonistic sentiments from the American people towards Russia. We've all seen the Ukraine flags on all the hardcore liberal yuppies. They would never be caught flying an American flag, but now somehow they find great patriotic fervor for Ukraine, simply to go to war with Russia. And so there was a real threat and danger in that kind of development. If that festered, Russia recognized that was a very high strategic danger. But there's also a case that Putin and Trump both have seen their countries nearly totally decimated by a regime far worse than communism. That this neoliberal dogma, which has the veneer of personal choices and personal preferences, so it doesn't have the dictatorship elements of the communist regime or of the Nazi regime. It maintains the pretense of choice, but yet it eviscerates the actual principles of your culture far more thoroughly than even fascism or communism. It's far more rapacious in its destruction. In some ways, it's even more destructive because it's kind of like a unseen mass killer, mass murderer. Communism, at least, waged an explicit attack on the church and the notion of God and the human soul. It was an overt attack. The neoliberal regime doesn't overtly attack it. They just induce increasing cultural tendencies and orientations that neglect the importance of the notion of God, the human soul, and of the invisible or higher principle domain of creation and existence. So there's a higher level of, you would say, an insidious attack upon civilization, far more refined and cultivated than the kind of sledgehammer of communism. And the Russians recognize this. Sometimes Americans and others try to paint that there's Joe Biden often does this. They just want to go back to the Soviet Union. Look at how Putin will sometimes talk about the Soviet Union. But in reality, what the Russians experienced in the 1990s under neoliberalism, under people like Jeffrey Sachs, was so evil, so satanic, and so destructive. Life expectancy of men drops to the low 50s. Alcoholism rages. Deaths of despair rage in Russia, unlike anything they'd ever seen in communism. Now, of course, some pretty severe things happened. I mean, you have the starvations in Ukraine, you have these other things under Stalin. So it's an intense. I'm not trying to say it's, but even compared to those, that maybe the loss of life in a period of time, maybe I haven't compared statistics. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But the kind of way it was done, where it was done under the idea that you're now going to have choices and options, and you can choose and build your own culture. And yet under that pretense or veneer, a level of destruction unthinkable took place over a decade. And this is really, people want to understand, where does Putin come from as a leader? You have to at least know that that's what Russia was going through in the 1990s under Yeltsin when Putin comes in. Could we not say the same thing about the United States these last 17 years? This kind of cultivating this regime, the kind of Fukuyama end of history regime. All we have now are a few social issues, some gay marriage, abortion, transgender rights, cleaner energy. These are the big concerns for human civilization. Everything else has been taken care of. Government structures, historical nature, the conflict of nations, economic productivity, food supply, all of that's solved. There is no need for historical figures or historical individuals. We just need a little bit of tuning and tweaking on some racism and a little sexism and a little, gay rights. Just those kinds of things are now the predominant issues we now have to address. That's the Democratic Party. That's where it emerges from. There's no longer history. It's now just these social agendas. And Obama becomes the person who, at the time the entire financial system collapses and their end of history regime is disintegrating, it's literally in global collapse. The whole financial and economic system is going under. They prop it up with trillions and trillions and trillions of money printing. And at the same time, they implement a program of economic austerity in things like healthcare. They just completely, radically intensified the what would be, you could say, not even incompetence, but the dysfunction of our healthcare system under Obamacare, and plunged us into a kind of neoliberal destruction of our civilization. And they thought they had us. And all of a sudden, Trump emerges. He emerges within that course of that 8 years. But he saw the destruction taking place. And Trump was smart enough to realize this isn't something new. They shut down our manufacturing. They shut down our industry. They shut down our tariffs going back to the 1970s and 80s. And it's only gotten worse since the 1990s with NAFTA and the WTO. So he actually saw the cultural destruction of neoliberalism tied to it's kind of the underpinning of its economic program. Both of them, but President Trump himself saw what this regime was. Mamdani is not even a communist. It's a radical neoliberal approach. And it's far more destructive to civilization than even the more overt elements. Because at least you can see what a communist is. You can see what a slave owner is. What you can't see is the kind of proliferation of narcotics to such a degree and the despair within your population that you're losing millions of young men and women every year just to the drug war, to fentanyl and to the opioids and to the pills. And almost no one says anything. So this is what we're addressing and solving. And I think it's just worth reminding what problem we're actually correcting, the deep strategic factors, and the kind of dialogue, whether this is all discussed within their meetings, to what degree they have time to get into these things. Only a few people, only 6 or so people really know what happened in Anchorage in the meeting. But why this meeting is so important, what they're addressing. Now, let me just turn quickly to what happened in Anchorage, what happened to today. So, of course, Trump had Zelensky in. Zelensky kind of did his fantasy island deplane routine. The European leaders came, kind of bunched together like a bunch of kind of high school overachievers who are really just happy to finally be at the table. But you can kind of tell that they had no historical relevance or significance. Trump brokered a deal with Russia. Did any of them get a red carpet? Did any of them? I mean, not that, as Trump himself said, it was a big deal for Putin to be willing to come to the United States. But, these people really don't have a lot of relevance. What they do have is a shared psychosis. They are completely indoctrinated and committed to the neoliberal agenda. All of the destruction. It hasn't solved any problem. Has it solved climate change? No. Are the social issues that it needed to solve? Is abortion under restraint? Are the gays is the gay community under any kind of threat? These kinds of things that were so-called the leading issues of civil rights and the great social changes that they were going to create in the 1990s. Are any of these huge festering problems? Or have their policies like climate? I mean, is climate change even a festering problem? That would be the best way to probably frame it. They're wedded to continuing that program, regardless of its destruction. And Trump is kind of a unique feature in this. His maturity and sense of concern for civilization generally gives him the patience to recognize, I've got to pull Europe out of this self-destructive mentality. So he's getting them to agree to rational steps, even if every voice they hear in their own heads and in all of their advisors and in their entire social collectivist thought is the contrary. Trump just keeps putting in front of them constructive steps. So where will this go? It's hard to say. I mean, the things look decent. Russia and Putin have said, I think they kind of realized at this point, we've got to give Ukraine some type of security guarantee. The question is, can the Russians trust the changes in the United States enough to make that work? Well, let's be honest, the Russians aren't going to trust it at all. What's happened over the last 10 years is Russia has built up an incredibly advanced military with some of the most advanced weaponry ever developed in human history. The hypersonics, the Oreshniks, the kinds of capabilities they have outpace even our military capability. It's why Trump is moving towards a defense system, a missile defense shield, because that's the best way to outflank this kind of these aggressive weaponries. So Russia isn't trusting any kind of security guarantee for itself, but it's willing to bet that the future of survival, the ability for any nation to actually pull itself together and survive, they've got to at least be willing, this is how I see it, they've got to give what Trump is attempting to do some backup. Doesn't mean they're really handing anything over. I think a big fight's probably going to come up regarding, can you deploy Western troops? How much Western equipment can be sold to Ukraine? I think those things are not necessarily included into security guarantees. But it's not for us to, I mean, and you may have your own thoughts. I'm sure you do. All I'm saying is that there's still areas to be negotiated. There's no doubt of that. But what we are looking at is the Russians recognize that this is a remarkable chance to have a major reset with the United States and to be able to do it as Trump is not just cutting off Europe. He's going to bring the kind of psychosis of Europe into a constructive domain. Like, you're dealing with people that are psychotic and you've got to get them to do something. You just have to find a way to get those kind of impatients to operate and agree that, look, don't you think it's time to eat some food? Isn't it time to do things that are in your best self-interest? I know you're absolutely psychotic and you just want to rant and rave about we've got to kill more Russians or we've got to destroy Russia. But what about you eating? What about you securing your own nation's existence in some way? Can you think just a couple of days, a few weeks, a few months down the line, not just obsess over your ideological brainwashing? That's literally what Trump is doing. And he's just patiently, slowly walking them in that direction. What's going to seal then the deal? And there's talk, I saw right before we got on the call, Trump has said he's already working on a trilateral. Zelensky has apparently agreed to at some level to land swaps. Trump apparently showed him a map. I'm sure there'll be some contested areas. There's going to be negotiations, but if there's an agreement of a land swap and there's an agreement on some degree of security guarantees, it looks like they're now in a position for more intense negotiations. But the reality of it is what Trump is creating is an opening for him then to secure long-term peace by major economic collaboration with Russia and to turn Europe into once again recognizing that it has a great potential of economic collaboration also with Russia. As much as people think Trump wants to just hook them up to American natural gas and these kinds of things, If Europe has its own self-interest, it's taking Russian cheap gas any day, 7 days a week. And I think anyone with any rationale realizes that's just an intrinsic relationship. Maybe you can pump it from Qatar all the way through Turkey. All of those things sound great and wonderful. You can ship it from the United States. We're already maxed out in terms of what we're sending. I'm sure you can expand that capability to some degree. The point is that Trump is ushering them in a direction of rational, constructive efforts where they can maintain the face that they haven't backed down, even though, despite that their regimes, the globalist regimes of these countries, are far more committed to a war with Russia because they've got to maintain control over that financial system. And a shift towards US-Russia collaboration economically means that there is now an increasing powerhouse of collaboration of major nations who will be directly opposed to globalist central banking control over financial system and control over the moments of severe financial crisis, because those will inevitably happen. And how those are responded to is largely what decides the kind of the winners and the losers. In the last case, Wall Street, the globally significant financial institutions, the G-SIFIs, were the winners. The global central banking system were the winners, and the population lost horribly. They chose the financial system over people and nations. Clearly, under Trump and Putin, the orientation, the rational, self-interested orientation of real political leadership is towards nations and their people. And that's something Trump has been consistent about these entire 9-10 years since he's gotten to the arena. So I think that's really the significance of this. He's dragging Europe along. Significant changes have taken place. And what most people don't understand is how much we are ultimately restructuring the way the world has functioned for almost 80 years, really 80 years, and if not longer. We're restructuring it towards something that can be viable. And it's taking physical step by step, but you've got to bring Europe along with it. You can't create this rogue, psychotic Europe. The last thing you want to do with psychotics is leave them in your rear where you don't know what's happening, where they don't no longer trust you. If you have a bunch of psychotics who are incredibly dangerous and bloodthirsty, you keep them very close and under monitor. That's what Trump is doing with these negotiations. His strategic focus is clear. Can he get it done? Does he have opposition in Congress? Does he have opposition in the media? Does he have opposition throughout the Republican Party and throughout Washington and all these other various layers? Absolutely. But most people don't fully understand the higher strategic game. And so Trump can operate off of what he sees as necessary to rebuild the United States and to rebuild our country. You're going to need to establish a system internationally where we have full control over the financial regime, that dollar-based regime, that we have direct sovereign influence on that, and we have unfettered direct relationships, trade, strategic, economic relationships with other major nations, unfettered by globalist meddling. Or at least, if not, unfettered. It can't be determined by them. They're always going to be meddling. But can you have an actual constructive relationship with these other major nations? That very much is the expression of a new economic and global system. So I think it's been a total success. I think that's why it's been a total success. And for a large portion of this, it's us understanding the broader strategic game, organizing members of Congress, organizing our citizens. A big factor in the midterm is going to be, can Trump pivot from this kind of international shift into increasing domestic focus on the major investments that need to happen here? And I think Trump totally recognizes that. His entire economic team recognizes that. They've got to move these tens of trillions of dollars of promised investments now directly into bolstering the blue collar and kind of economic boom in the United States. And that's kind of the pivot Trump sees. And he's got to put an incredible amount of focus on getting this thing into a position of constructive dialogue so that he can increasingly pivot towards that domestic agenda and not be undermined by these kind of international tensions. because that's certainly, if you've watched politics long enough, you know, as soon as things get moving here domestically, something seems to pop internationally that draws all of our attention and focus away from addressing some kind of major domestic and economic potential. And so I think that's the strategic factor we're looking at. I think Trump has worked this exhaustively with brilliance and courage and total success as it looks right now. But as he says, and I think is entirely true, we don't have a deal until we have a deal. That deal will incorporate a large portion of economic dialogue. Russians brought something like 300 to 400 businessmen to Anchorage. Trump's economic team, Lutnick, Besant, and the other people that came with him in his cabinet and perhaps others, were probably having side meetings because there was only, was it just Witkoff, Rubio, and Trump, I think, in the bilateral with Putin in Anchorage. So there is ongoing a sense of the economic potential that needs to help secure Russia's sense that they are actually building a bridge into a different kind of strategic security realm, that there is security for Russia long term because there is an increasing sense of collaborative effort within the United States towards Russia. So anyways, I could keep going. I think this is really important just to touch on. I'm sure you guys have tons of questions. I'm seeing all kinds of stuff in the chat box. So let me leave my comments there. Keisha, bring you back in and let's see what people have to say tonight.
Okay, great. Yes, there are a lot of comments. I think some interesting discussion already taking place in the chat, and we can start to bring that into the dialogue. I also just wanted to mention that in the context of what you were discussing around the role of the British and the role of those who were involved during the Obama-Biden administration, going back to 2014 in the coup in Ukraine, the Russians recognize this as well in terms of the Five Eyes, British influence, Christopher Steele. And today there was a statement that was put out, which I think is very warranted, about calling on the British in particular to Moscow calls on London not to interfere with efforts to settle Ukrainian conflict. And so they know that it has been the role of the British who have put forth the lies, Russiagate collusion, who have been continuing to push this war. And this came out today in TASS from the Russian authorities and the foreign ministry spokeswoman there on very stark warnings against London interfering in these negotiations that are being discussed right now, which again, people can't discount, going back to how did we get into this mess in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and the Russians have been consistent about that now for a little while. So.
Very much so. Okay. So just for those who would like to join in discussion, we encourage you